Welcome everyone to Minnesota Statewide Alumni Chapter of Phi Alpha Delta's continuation of our monthly panel series. Last year we took on an important issue, race, and this month we're taking on another important issue, that of gender. This is entitled Gender Equality and Inclusion, Diverse Perspectives. One Minnesota CLE credit has been applied for. CLE code is 417611. I will put that in the chat as well. I'm really excited about our panel. We have Danny Leader from the Atlanta Alumni and Lavender Chapter. She'll be speaking about gender neutral language. We also have Alexandria Richard from New Hampshire Alumni. She'll be speaking about gender equality and discrimination and the mechanics of filing EEOC claims. And then we have a repeat panelist, Jacqueline Justice. Always great to see you, from South Sound Alumni Chapter. She'll be talking about the intersectionality of race and gender. Then we'll have some time at the end for questions. So I'll let the panelists briefly introduce themselves first. Tell us who you are, what you do. Let's start with Danny.
Hey y'all, I am Danny Leader. I am a child advocate attorney. I'm also on the Lambda Legal Atlanta Leadership Council and previously have done quite a lot of work with the big three LGBTQ organizations, and I'm also the founder of the Lavender Chapter, which is our LGBTQ and ally chapter.
Great, thanks. Let's go to Alexandria.
Hello, I'm Alex Richard. I am a part of New Hampshire Statewide Alumni Chapter and District 18 ADJ. I worked at the New Hampshire Commission for Human Rights in New Hampshire. We dealt with discrimination in employment, access, public access, and housing. And I also helped to get cases over to the EEOC, which is its own filing. So I dealt with that. So I have some knowledge of the area, and I'm happy to forward my knowledge of this area.
And do you go by Alex?
I do go by Alex, yes.
Great. Let's go to Jacqueline.
Hi everybody, my name is Jacqueline Justice. I go by Jackie. I am an attorney out here in Washington State. I do a lot of disability, Social Security disability work, and also do some child welfare representation like Danny does. So.
Great. Well, we have a lot to discuss, so let's get into the presentation. We'll start with Danny, and I have a presentation to share as well. So I'll get that started.
Okay. So as Corey is queuing up, so as Corey is queuing up the slides, I felt like it was very important for us to discuss why gender neutral language is such a big deal, and specifically why we should be starting to have it be the thing that we use in the law. So one of the icebreaker jokes that I always like to have is one, and if you already know the answer, don't yell it out. But if you don't know the answer, feel free to write down what you think the answer is, and we're going to come back to it a little bit later. A father and son were in a car accident where the father was killed. The ambulance brought the son to the hospital. He needed immediate surgery. In the operating room, a doctor came in, looked at the little boy, and said, "I can't operate on him. He's my son." So who's the doctor?
I've heard this joke before.
I'm sure you have. It's a good one. Just kind of a think one. So if we could go on to the next slide while everyone's putting down their thoughts. Okay. So one of the big things that we hear when we're talking about gender neutral language is that it's not grammatically correct, or that there's no precedent for it. When we're talking about specific words, the wonderful thing about English is that a lot of the new slang that we use nowadays has been around for a couple hundred years. Specifically, when we're talking about the singular they, we've seen it as early as 1325 in translations of a French text and in original English literature in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, specifically in the prologue of the petitioner's poem. So singular they, we use in a pretty much constant, I would say, sort of when we're talking in formal and informal settings. If you're not sure of a person's gender, it is the most prevalent gender marker that we use. Most people nowadays do not say, I think he, this random person that I don't know about, will be doing it. And it's actually because the use of he as a descriptor gender for someone who does not have a known gender is artificial. It was created by a bunch of grammarians in the 1700s because they thought that it sounded low class to refer to people as they. And it was a movement that was started specifically by the aristocracy in England to prove that they were better than the rest of us. So if we're talking about using pronouns in a ungendered way, maybe we should examine where they come from, especially since the way that we use language always has implications of classism, racism, or colonialism, especially in this particular case. The use of he was as a way to have a shibboleth. So only those that had been raised in specific sets of society knew that he or man referred to everyone instead of everyone referring to everyone or anyone referring to anyone or they referring to people that we don't know about. And we see this bear out in terms of prejudice later on. It's not that the language that we use doesn't matter, it's incredibly important. When we have class markers, we found that people are more likely to be judged by that language. Think about if you're from a rural area and you were taught to talk right. I know I certainly was because I used to have a very, very deep accent. And I was taught that I have to speak a certain way in order to be understood. And more importantly, in order for people to think that I knew what I was talking about, despite all of this paperwork saying that, yes, I know what I'm talking about. So when we're talking about language, we also see it describe the world around us and shape the way that we understand the world around us. There are a number of reports and studies that we've seen over the years, but the easiest one to think about is how in English we have one main word for the color blue, but two for the color red. We have pink and red. And because of that, we see all of the various shades of blue as one color, but we see pink as distinct from red. The language shapes the way that we view the world. And we see this specifically in the way that the language that we use shapes the way that we view other people. In 2019, the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences did a meta-analysis of 3 different Swedish studies on gender neutrality and specifically the use of a now commonly adopted gender-neutral pronoun hen in 2016, 2017, and 2018. And they found that when a gender-neutral pronoun was used, that the person reading the directions using that pronoun was less likely to use their implicit bias to name a person as a male name, and were more likely to use female names or ungendered names. Additionally, we saw in that study that when the non-gender pronoun was used, there were 3 times more likely to have positive feelings towards LGBTQ and female task doers, people who were taking part in the task. So the way that we use language can directly impact the way that we view others and can directly impact the likelihood that a person will be accepted for a job, will be seen as an authority figure, and so on. Now, as towards the law thing, because that's what we're all here for, when we use imprecise language like men or man to refer to both everyone and specific genders, it creates loopholes. And we saw that loophole exploited in 1911 by UK suffragettes who boycotted the census because the census specifically was to do a collection of all persons, but when we were looking at law definitions in regarding to voting rights, the words in Voting Right Acts were not persons, they were instead man and men. But in other laws, such as, criminal laws, when they used man or men, it applied to everyone, not just men, not just boys, not just people who were raised as men. It referred to everyone. But somehow there was this little carve out for voting rights. And we see something similar in the 1800s before the Civil War in smaller communities, specifically in Kentucky, where women were trying to get voting rights and were not considered people because only men were considered people, yet they were counted under the census. So the fact that we have in our foundational documents the use of men and man interchangeably with everyone, but really only kind of, means that we're creating ourselves imprecise language. We're causing issues in the future when we want to make sure that we're applying laws equally. Think for a second about the Declaration of Independence. How does it start? After the preamble, we're talking about the rights of men, the rights of man, and what things have been done to justify why we need to leave England. However, it's not that taxation only occurred to the male of the species, it occurred to everyone that was buying sugar, tea, and stamps. It's not that yet when we're talking about things like every man is equal, we're not actually talking about everyone in the species. We're only talking about white male owners of property. So that imprecise language, even though it seemed very precise back in the day, creates lots of legal loopholes that can be pretty easily remedied by using gender neutral and more accurate language. And that's actually borne out when we're looking at the growing movement within the international agencies, communities, and judiciary. When we look at their use within recent opinions, almost always they're going to be using they or he or she, unless we're talking about a specific named defendant or plaintiff, at which point they'll use those particular pronouns. There's the lessening of the word of mankind in the significantly higher use of the word humankind. Within the last 10 years, we've seen humankind not only become equal with mankind, but actually overtake it, and it's now 4 times more likely to be used in opinions than mankind. We're seeing the reduction of the words he, comma, she, or that really bulky phrase he or she to they, and that is now the one that is most used in opinions. It's 60% of opinions will use gender neutral language when we're talking about at the federal level, appellate courts and above. So the great thing is that when we're asking people to use gender neutral language, we already do it. We just need to acknowledge when we're writing that we can do it even better. So next slide, please. One of the areas that's likely to be coming up is that in 2020, Bostock versus Clayton County, which is from my home state of Georgia, affirmed that discrimination based on gender identity or expression is sex discrimination. And what we are anticipating happening is a lot of policies coming out being very explicit about that, and more accurately, creating guidelines for how to address people when we do not already have a language in part. A lot of policy manuals will say the manager will do this, and then he will send in whatever he needs to send it. But we anticipate in the next several years that most agencies will update their language to be gender neutral so that they do not have a prima facie Bostock issue. And the Department of Labor actually has a really lovely resource guide on their how to deal with this, which I'm sure that Alex will get into a little bit more. That's her wonderful area, but I'm really looking forward to seeing how this is going to play out. Also, and this one may be obvious to some people, but not as much to others. When we use male defaulted language like policeman or congressman, we assume in the way that we use our language that men are the authority figures. And while that's fine, men can be authority figures, there's a lot of other people who can also be authority figures. And we found that when we use gender neutral language, you are 25% more likely to hire a person who is not a man, when you are using name and anonymizing software, women almost always are hired over their other male applicants because, as Jackie and Alex can probably talk about, a lot of the way that we got raised growing up is that in order to be equal with guys, we had to be better, which isn't fair to anyone because that's just not appropriate for anyone to be pitting us against each other. We're all, human. We're all supposed to be on the same side. But unfortunately, because of the biases that we're raised with, it means that a lot of the time when women and people who are assigned female at birth are applying for positions, they will only apply if they are 90 or 95% off that tick list of the job description, whereas men are more likely to apply if they hit even 28%. So that's a huge discrepancy that feeds into the pay gap. It also just kind of shows our own internal biases because of the way that we were all socialized. Next slide, please. So back to the joke. Who was the doctor? And if anyone wants to type into the chat what they think the answer is, because there's multiple answers and any of them would be okay. I just want to see what y'all's thoughts were. Okay, we have the child's mother, an adoptive parent. Another option is the same-sex partner of the father. Another person would have said the biological parent or the biological father. Now, this is a really old joke, and by a really old joke, the first instance that I could find in print was from '76. So it's a solid joke. Most of you have probably heard it before, but the joke back in the day was an actual joke and not just a, that's kind of weird the way that we feel about it now, because women as a doctor is so bizarre in most people's worldview. The wonderful thing is that I've actually said this joke in several other panels, and including with kids, and the kids come up with the best answers ever. Like all of them are like, it's the mom or it's the dad's husband. And I'm like, oh, the world is getting better. Makes me so happy. But we still have those internal biases, right? If that's the first time you're hearing your joke and you thought, oh, that's kind of weird. I wonder who the father is. I thought the father was dead, or wait, what's going on? All of those are okay. You're allowed to have different thoughts. No one's expecting anyone to be perfect. We just need to acknowledge our own implicit biases. And one of those biases is that because of the way that we are raised in this country specifically, we tend to assume that people in authority are male, and we can work towards ending that bias. Let's go on to the next one. So what's the fix? Well, the fix is that because we use male gendered language as the default, mankind, congressmen, policemen, it's assumed that most of the people we're talking about are male unless stated otherwise. Female gendered words are often used in service industry work, such as stewardess, hostess, and they also seem to imply that the person is less through the use of that diminutive suffix ESS. Unfortunately, we also have seen that once a field is believed to be female dominated, the pay goes down. That's something called pink collaring. And while we can't necessarily fix that all by ourselves, what we can do is start to change the way that we use language to create different assumptions, to get rid of some of those biases that we all have internalized, and kind of just make it a little bit easier for other people. So one of the fixes is to change the language. So stewardess becomes steward, because a steward could be a male or female. They could also be a person who has a different gender. Hostess becomes host. Again, it could be a person of any gender. Same thing for chairman, becomes chair. Policeman becomes police officer. Then we start getting into the use of pronouns. He, she, he, or she. That he or she phrase is very, what's the word? Clunky? It's clunky. it's hard. It feels like the she is an afterthought. So a really easy way to not only save characters, but also to just not have any bias implied there is to use the word they. Same thing for his, hers, his or hers becomes their. Him, her, him or her becomes them. Or if you want to get rid of that pronoun, instead, I make it into an indefinite article, the use of the. In that particular case, it would be something like, they need to turn in the report instead of their report or something similar. Okay. Next slide, please. Okay. So everyone likes to ask me why I'd really dislike he or she, and I have a lovely little bit from James McCaster. So if we could click on the YouTube link. When we are analyzing the language that people use, the people who write he or she are 86% of the time male, whereas people who are more likely to use they are either female or AFAB. And while that is really fun to watch, that means that we have bias in the way that not only we are writing, but the way that we have been taught to write. Now, the issue is that even as recently as 2015, in style guides, especially at law schools, he or she and he as the gender neutral pronoun of choice was the preference. But that's outdated, and it has been outdated. The UN created its own way of having gender inclusive language as early as 2001. And one of the very first things that they discussed is that gender neutral he implies that only he exists and completely ignores that fact that women do exist, as well as other gendered identities. So where can we start? What can we do to fix it? Excuse me. The first thing we can do is look at the way that we draft our orders and our templates, especially if you're in litigation. Use gender neutral language. I'm more than willing to share these slides, and I have quite a lot of citation at the bottom, as Corey can probably see, all of my sources, but several of them include style guides. We have the UN style guide, we have Louisiana style guide, we have Canada style guide, all of which are talking about gender inclusive and gender neutral language. We can also make sure that we respect our clients' titles and pronouns, especially in court. If they're a doctor, call them a doctor. I do not care what gender they are. Doctor is their title, and they have done the, I was going to say the time, but that's not quite accurate. They've done the effort to make sure that they get that title, so we should respect it. And I know that this is a movement that we've used in my courtroom because we have people of many different genders. Instead of saying Ms. Leader, Ms. Justice, Ms. Richard, they would say Attorney Justice, Attorney Leader, Attorney Richard. And it puts everyone kind of on an even playing field, which is really lovely. I would also start by reaching out to your state ethics group. If your state bar has an ethics group, they might already be starting this, but if not, probably their appellate advocacy group is, where they're making efforts to change the court rules to be more gender neutral. So there's lots of ways of doing it, but the great thing is that we're always learning, we're always getting better. And I would just really encourage you to, if you see an opening, see if you can't take it, make it a little bit easier. So before we go on, does anyone have any quick questions for this specific section before we go back to the next person and their more general questions?
I have one for attorneys specifically. What would you say about opening letters like with things like sir or madam? What kind of alternatives would you suggest?
Yeah, so we've seen the movement away from sir, madam, miss, ma'am, and instead using the words like dear client, dear potential client, dear staff, or if we know the name of the person, using the name of the person. If we're saying dear sir or madam, simply use to whom it may concern or to the party. There are quite a number of ways. There's quite a number of ways that we can change things around, so it's not implying any genders. The other thing that we need to remember is that there are people who don't use sir or madam. Like I'm not a sir, I'm not a ma'am, I'm not a miss. I'm Dana, I'm gender fluid, and none of those really fit me very well. So there are other languages that have that gender fluid neutral, but we don't have that in English, unfortunately. Jackie.
And Danny, I would also say, find the person to whom you're addressing a letter or memorandum. It's kind of, I don't want to say it's lazy, but it's a little lazy, and if you're writing to a body as a whole, it's the commission or it's, whatever it might be, but know who you're addressing, know your audience. I think that that's just a writing
Yeah, absolutely.
101.
When you can use a name, use their name.
Yeah.
If we're doing a form letter, if we're doing a prospectus to multiple people, then there's really no reason to be using something like sir or madam to the addressee or to whom it may concern work just as well.
Yes.
And I think that kind of wraps it up for me.
Great. Thanks, Danny. That was very informative. Jackie, I believe you have a conflict at 1, so do you want to go next? Is that accurate? You need to leave right at 1 Central. Or Alex, do you have a time that you need to leave? It's about 12:30, so I think we have time to get through it. Let's go with Jackie since her video is on. Go ahead and talk about the intersectionality of race and gender.
Sure. So I guess I want to start out with a definition of intersectionality. It's become a really hot topic these days, but just so we're all on the same page, it's really just the understanding that more than one thing can be true at the same time, right? People exist in their gender, in their race, in their religion, all at the same time as a whole person, and recognizing where those things intersect to cause challenges for people is really important to know. So obviously this panel is more focused on gender and race and gender. I think that it's kind of focusing in on that. It's really interesting to see how that can play out in the legal field, right? And I can tell you from personal experience how easy it is to feel gaslit when it comes to people making comments that are maybe not appropriate. Was that because I'm Black? Was that because I'm a woman? Was it both? The answer to all of those questions is yes, right? Something specific as it relates to me is my hair. It gets a little crazy sometimes. And I've certainly had comments made about the professionalism of my hair. Now, is that because women have very specific standards of professionalism and what that looks like in a courtroom? Or is it because I'm Black? I don't know, right? I don't know what the intent behind those comments are, but it doesn't really matter, right? And so when we are walking through our interactions with our colleagues, I think that we all have to be mindful, and our clients and the court, everybody that we're coming into contact with, we have to be mindful of them as a whole person. And it's not necessarily obvious where, what quote unquote category somebody falls into, which is why it's so important. I mean, Danny just gave us some really good gender neutral language. And I think that having that as a framework really helps remove some of those preconceived notions, right? At least from a gender standpoint. Now, the difficulty becomes when we try to say, well, I don't care about race, or I don't care about gender, I treat everybody the same, because that really ignores that whole person. And when we say things like, Danny brought up, he or she, right? It happens a lot when we're talking about IDEA work, where you'll hear women and people of color, right? Implying that we're talking about white women and then people of color, right? When there's a whole section of that that's not focused on the whole. So, excuse me, I have not finished my morning coffee. It's only 10:30 out here. But I think
Go ahead.
that,
It's a lunch CLE in the Midwest, but it's a morning CLE on the West Coast. So.
Aren't you guys special? I wish I was halfway through my day. No.
Good.
That said, I think a lot of this comes down to us trying to categorize people, right? And I think that Danny walked through a really, really good history of how the language that we use very much intentionally categorizes people. And so when we're talking about race and gender, I think that's another really important thing to keep in mind is, where does this come from? Why am I thinking about this in these ways? How did we get here, right? And recognizing that various systems compound on top of each other for certain groups of people, this is very necessary, whether it comes to serving your clients, whether it comes to, whether we're talking about interacting with your peers, right? So I guess my question for folks is, what ways have you witnessed kind of that lack of awareness around somebody's intersectionality, right? I think that is how we kind of move forward, is to examine situations in which that's happened. I really don't want to speak the whole time, Corey, but so I guess I just sort of ask people to share some of those situations and kind of how they dealt with them.
Oh, that's totally fine. I mean, it's interesting to me because I think society at large just doesn't really know how to talk about Black women. There's a lot of the focus on slavery and civil rights. It's focused on Black men, incarceration and things like that. And then often Black women get left out of women's movements as well. So basically, I wanted to highlight the importance of intersectionality in those movements, and how do we talk about that? So yeah, go ahead.
Well, and absolutely, I actually so Natalie Perryman from Memphis, she was involved in the Women Lawyers Association down there, and she sent me a sweatshirt that her group had made that said, you know, "Ain't I a woman?" And that was from that's actually a quote from a Black abolitionist who, you know, as a female was, you know, you've got all of these standards for women and deference that's supposed to be shown and treatment of women, where this individual was not given that same deference. But, you know, and her response to all of that is, "Ain't I a woman?" Right? I am also a woman. And so you're right, Corey. I don't think that we know how to talk about women of color. We don't know how to talk about a lot of intersections that women, you know, in the LGBTQ community might experience and how that looks. I mean, we don't know how to talk about that multiple layers. John, yeah, it was Sojourner Truth. That's exactly right. Yep. It's a really good quote. Yeah. So Alex, I saw you had your hand up. Did I miss that? Or did you put it down?
I did have my hand up. Intersectionality, I wanted to put out there. I'm a woman with a disability, and that aspect of it kind of gets forgotten as well. You know, I have things that I have to overcome due to my disability, but they seem to only focus on one aspect of either the disability or being a female rather than dealing with both. So yes, can certainly attest to that.
Yeah. Danny?
Yeah, well, so what I was going to point out is that one of the reasons that the intersectional movement came out of the womanist movement, which is a Black feminist movement, is because when we were talking about feminism, specifically second wave feminism, it was focusing on how things affected people as women. But there is a racialized aspect to the way that Black women are treated. Misogynoir has its own name for a reason, and it's because it's its own concept. And we say that in the same way when we're talking about Black men. The way that we view Black men's gender is different from the way that we view white men's gender or Asian men's gender, because it's so particularized. When you were talking about the way that you intersect, Alex, with disability and womanhood, I was thinking about one of my favorite disability advocates, Imani Barbarin, and how she, as a Black woman who has multiple disabilities, will point out that you can, and often in medical settings especially, people will either treat her as a woman or treat her as disabled or treat her as a Black person. And none of the three will meet, even though she is all three at the same time. And the way that it often comes up, and unfortunately in our country, we have a history of sterilizing two of those groups, Black people and other people of color, and disabled people. But when we're talking about the sterilization of disabled people, that is disproportionately disabled women. It's 95% of the time disabled women. It is rarely going to be a disabled man, because somehow, even in our ableism, we still make room for that misogyny. So the way that any particular person sits at the intersection is going to be particularized. And so I think often when people are learning first about intersectionality, and I know I made this mistake when I was younger, I'm not going to say I was a kid because I was like in my 20s, but I thought that intersectionality was like, well, yeah, of course race affects you and being a woman and all of these things, but it's not just the and, it's the whole way that those interact with each other. So that a person can have multiple marginalizations and have the same number as a different person, but they will interact with the world in a completely different way. And I know I'm on TikTok too much, so please forgive me for the joke I'm about to make, or not the joke, but the comment I'm about to make. But for a while there was this very strong trend within TikTok talking about how because white women and Black men I'm trying to say it in the nicest way because I know the argument started out in earnest and people just didn't know what they were talking about because they experience the same level of marginalization, they have the same level of privilege, and that's just like not factual, right? Because Black men are going to have privileges in some areas that white women are not going to have. White women are going to have privileges in a lot of areas that Black men don't have. And it's not a matter of ranking or hierarchy. It's a matter of the way that the entire system impacts that individual person. And we need to stop treating oppression, marginalization as a hierarchy and start treating it as a very particularized way that it affects each individual person because of the experiences that they have.
Yeah, and in talking about privilege and how that kind of impacts you based on all of these different categories, I mean, there's some really interesting and simple exercises out there that really kind of visualize some of that. If you come from a single parent household, take, one step back, right? If and all of these things that go into create the position that people are in. Again, I think we all have to understand that more than one thing can exist at the same time. More than one thing can be true. And you don't overcome certain things just because you also belong to this other category, right? And so when we're having discussions around race, gender, LGBTQ issues, like it's important to have those difficult conversations and kind of start by saying, you know what, I don't necessarily know anything about this, right? As somebody that does not have the same physical challenges as somebody that has a physical disability. I don't identify as a member of the LGBTQ community. I need to step back and learn more about how that intersection impacts Alex. I need to step back and understand how that intersection impacts Danny, right? That is my work to do. And there's a lot of readings and there's a lot of really interesting folks to follow. And actually somebody in the chat just dropped Kimberly Crenshaw's name. And yeah, definitely in terms of, she coined that phrase, and a lot of really interesting work that has been done, by her and other folks. So I encourage all of you guys to just, start that conversation, really have it, really try to understand the history behind a lot of this and the impact that has even on how we interact with people today. It's really important.
Thanks, Jackie. That's another issue we could have a whole seminar on. Let's move to Alex, and while she's getting her video set up, I just wanted to share a couple of photographs of art pieces that kind of made me think of. I was just the first one is the bronze sculpture by Kristen Visbal, 4-foot girl standing in front of the Wall Street Bull. I've seen this in places as far away as Norway. And the other one is this protest picture from Baton Rouge, taken by Jonathan Bachman of Reuters. It's an award-winning photograph. A young woman being arrested by police and standing defiantly and just having this quiet power. So I just thought those were very powerful.
I can't see that second picture, Corey.
You cannot see it.
No, I'm still seeing the young girl in the bowl.
Sharing is paused. Resume.
I think you just need to click on the other tab.
Hold on, let me try this again. Because this is a very powerful image. I want to make sure everyone can see it. There we go. So that's all I had to say about that. We can go to Alex now. Go ahead, Alex.
Hello. My presentation is going to be kind of cut forward. I'm talking about accessing the law and the equal rights in terms of bringing a charge of discrimination either through the EEOC or your local humanitarian organization to do a charge of discrimination. Typically, they deal with employment. The Equal Opportunity Council is only for employment. So if you have discrimination for any protected class outside of employment, you would have to go to your local organization. In Minnesota, it is the Human Rights Office. So I found it interesting that Minnesota's website themselves says that they have one of the most progressive equal rights statutes in the nation. So I was proud to see that they put that out there and that they are one of the foremost ones that other states go towards to see what they have done. So Minnesota law, the state law prohibits discrimination in employment, housing, public accommodation, public services, education, credit, and businesses based on any protected classes, which include race, religion, disability, national origin, sex, marital status, familial status, age, sexual orientation, and gender identity, which of course, gender identity and sexual identity is the more recent one with the with Bostock coming out of the Supreme Court in 2020, which not that far ago, which seems crazy to think that we've had these discussions of equal rights and gender-based issues for so long, and only recently has the federal government come on par with that. I see someone's comment that there's little success for going through the human rights process. And unfortunately, it is a very hard standard to overcome, which I will get to in just a moment. So going with the EEOC first, they take cases, but you have to meet certain standards to get to them first. So typically they do want you to go to your local organization first, and try to go through the process with them. And once they make a case or determine that they cannot take your case, you can kind of appeal that to the EEOC. The EEOC will then assess the allegations and determine to take a charge on your behalf or your client's behalf and make a finding. If they determine that discrimination has occurred, then they will try to do a settlement. If they are not able to get a settlement, then you can do a lawsuit in an actual court rather than one of the governing bodies. So it's kind of a lengthy process because typically your local organization, most states say that it can take up to a year. Some states are longer, especially with the backlog of COVID and everything like that. So it can be a lengthy process, but once you start that adjudication in any kind of way, it does kind of toll or pause your time frame because you've already started that process. Most states have a time frame that you have to start your complaint within a year, anywhere between 6 months and a year. The EEOC bumped that up a few years ago to be a full year rather than the, I think it was 180 days when I was back at New Hampshire. And so they did bump that up, and most states have followed suit in order to make it equal. But that includes the getting your signature, first-hand signature. So it can't be a signed item that you email in. It has to be a physical copy of your signature and get that in properly. So then you can adjudicate through the courts after the EEOC has brought it on your behalf or on your client's behalf. So the Bostock decided that the firing or not hiring of individuals based on their sexual orientation or transgender status violates Title VII and is discrimination on the basis of sex. So that was really important because it's not only sexual identity or sexual orientation, but it's also transgender and how you present yourself, because that was something that was ignored for a while. It just kind of went to the wayside of talking about sexual identity. So with this, a lot has been passed since in terms of states in order to build upon that. Again, states can have more rights than the federal government, and the federal government takes a while to catch up to how we typically feel as a society, or half of us feel as a society. Title VII was originally passed in 1964, and that prohibited employment discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. So obviously the gender identity that we are talking about here today was ignored in that, but there's been many amendments, luckily, and it's come up to more of what we think of in society, thankfully. So in terms of bringing a case in your local district, typically it's not just you or your client as a person feeling that they're being discriminated against. There has to be a factual basis. So it could be another customer coming in and harassing them. And this is not just a one instance, it's multiple instances of discrimination or harassment based on gender or gender identity, sexual orientation, etc. So it is, if they have this constant harassment or instances of discrimination and they have brought it to managers' attention and nothing has been done. So it has to be a systematic approach to it. It can't just be a one-off. And it can be coworkers, it can be managers, it can be anyone within the organization or even outside that has done this, but it is an issue that has been brought up and not addressed appropriately. It also touches on retaliation. So if you bring up this notice of, I feel that I've been discriminated against because of such and such, and nothing is done, and you keep on bringing awareness of what is going on, and the company decides, you know what, you're just bringing too many issues to us, we're going to lower your hours that you work, or we're going to dock your pay, that is considered retaliation. And that one instance of that is a valid reason to try to bring a charge of discrimination with your local organization. The local organizations will take your information and determine if it meets the prima facie standards of bringing a case of discrimination. So Minnesota on their website itself has an entry form that you can fill out, and it gets sent to your organization, and they'll look at it and reach out and say if they think that you might have a case based on the information that you provided, or if they need more information, and go forward from there. But you do have to meet the preliminary standards to even start the process. What you can do, some local organizations will decide to do almost a, not a stopgag, basically ask the organization, hey, we've heard some things were going on that might meet standards of discrimination. We just want to remind you of what the laws are in order to try to prevent a case from coming forward, but that's all based on local jurisdiction and if they do that or not. In New Hampshire, we did it primarily for public access. So again, local standards, and every state is different, unfortunately, / also fortunately, because some states have more rights than others. But once you meet that standard for your local organization, they will bring a civil-based lawsuit against the organization that discriminated against you in employment, public access, all those great areas where you can be discriminated against. And then it can take a year. They try to do adjudication. They try to avoid that and try to get settlements and try to figure that out without having to go through the whole process. But both in Minnesota and New Hampshire, it goes to a commission. So it's not done through the courts. The commission, who is either voted or appointed by state representatives, will determine the case and see if it meets the legal standard of discrimination. If you do not meet the standard there, you can try to bring it up to the EEOC if it's within employment. Unfortunately, if you don't meet the standard in the other areas of law, the only place to bring it is civil court if your state allows that. And for a lot of them, they don't. I know in New Hampshire, public access wasn't something that you could adjudicate in civil court. It was just something that you had to go to your local town and try to fight. And so that would be something that you would have to get your community to rally behind you, basically, in order to get that figured out, rather than having an actual agency that would fight for your rights, or an actual place to bring forward any, basically get your case settled, unfortunately. So it does sometimes come down to your community backing and how much access or how much notoriety you can get into it. So going to local news stations and stuff like that can also be a way to broker that support. So unfortunately, it's not just one agency that you can go to. It does seem to be multi-leveled. But I think that's all I got. It's a lot of information to throw at y'all. So if you have any questions, certainly I'd be happy to answer. Again, I only know from what I've researched from Minnesota and my personal experience in New Hampshire, but I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Alex. It is a convoluted process. I've dealt with it before. And there's a local organization called Gender Justice that knows the process well. So reach out to them if you have questions. I'll just conclude briefly, and then if we have any further questions or last thoughts, we can go ahead with that. But thanks everyone for coming today. The CLE code is in the chat. That's pending. We have a couple more events coming up. Panel on disability on November 12th at noon Central. And then we're planning a talk on finances on December 2nd, also at noon. So thanks everyone again. Any lingering questions or final thoughts from the presenters? All right, hearing none, the recording will be on the member section of the PAD website. And thanks again, everyone.